Alright, so this is a quick overview of how to set up a professional looking Excel workbook to give a reader, whether it's a professor, whether it's a CFO, whoever it may be, information regarding the prospects for a proposed project. So we're going to cover a number of different things in this example. First and foremost, this is a professional presentation. We want to make sure it's clear, it's well labeled, and our conclusions are accurate and well explained. So to start with, labels. Labels everywhere. Each worksheet should have its own title. In this case, we've got the name of the company, the name of the project, and the base case. So in this worksheet, we're going to lay out our key inputs, our key variables, look at the cash flows, and then we've got our results. You can see down at the bottom we've got a number of different worksheets, and each worksheet is labeled so that it's clear what information is on each worksheet. Okay, so starting at the top, we've got our title, and then we've got part one, which includes our key inputs, our key metrics, and our key results. So you can see I've highlighted the titles of the different sections to make it easier to read. Again, we want to make this as easy as possible for our reader to interpret. And each section is labeled appropriately. We have investment outlays and termination data here. We've got operating cash flow data here. And then on the right, we have our key results. Now, I've put the key results front and center so that if for nothing else, our reader sees these results and understands what the ultimate conclusion of this analysis is. And you'll notice I've highlighted the key results in a different color than the rest of the workbook to make them pop and stand out even more, and that should draw your eye to those results first. Underneath the results is a brief interpretation of them and perhaps a suggestion about whether or not to approve this project. So you can see in this conclusion, the project didn't meet the criteria because, for instance, it was a loss. Maybe it didn't meet the internal rate of return cutoff, profitability index, whatever. Okay, so that's the first part. Now we move down to the second part, again, labeled nicely so it's clear, understanding what information is going to be down here. We have intermediate calculations, and then we've got our operating cash flow calculations. Now you'll note that the intermediate calculations are separate from the operating cash flow calculations. And this is done on purpose to make it easier to understand and read the operating cash flows. So they should look very much like a normal accounting statement. We don't want to confuse it with a bunch of erroneous information. So in all of our worksheets, whether it's our cash flow, our intermediate calculations, our scenarios, which we'll see later, time goes horizontally. Again, this is to keep the formatting the same as traditional accounting worksheets and just makes it easier to understand. So we have our initial calculations up there, and then we've got our cash flow statement. And it's important to include in this cash flow statement not just different parts of the cash flows, but intermediate sums as well. So for instance, net operating income before taxes. This is important not only from a grading standpoint, but it also, again, makes it easier for your reader to interpret what's going on. They can see the steps that you took to arrive at your final cash flow projections. Okay. So moving on from our base case, we're going to look at our scenarios. And again, this worksheet has at the top a title, the name of the company, the name of the project, and then what this worksheet is about, in this case, scenario analysis. So in this worksheet, we have 3 different scenarios, and each is labeled base case, high demand, and low demand. These may not be the most informative labels, but they are labels nonetheless, and they at least distinguish between the 3 different scenarios. Now I've highlighted in tan those variables that are changing from one scenario to the next. And I've done this, again, to make it easy on the reader. You'll notice a theme here. We don't want to give our reader a lot of information and mix in variables that are changing and variables that are not changing so that they have a hard time figuring out what our rationale for analyzing these different scenarios is and what variables are important and what variables are not important to each scenario. Now, to go along with the variables that are changing, there's a section that shows the output from that analysis. Again, these are the same variables that are found in the key results on the first page. There's an interpretation or conclusion for that particular scenario, and there's a description of that scenario, which makes it a little bit more realistic. By providing a scenario description, our reader can understand why we are considering the variables that we are, and maybe what that means in a real-world sense. So we have our different scenarios, again, labeled appropriately. Each one needs to have the results, the conclusion, and a description of the scenario. And then we come down to the bottom where we compare those scenarios side by side. So we have all three, and you can see, again, time going across horizontally. We can look at the cash flows, the net present value, and I've highlighted again in green some of the most important key variables that then harken back to those initial key results on the first page. And finally, there's an overall conclusion for this project analysis. This includes a little bit of scenario, but a lot about our assumptions, a lot about what we think is good and what we think is bad about our analysis. Maybe what some of the next steps are to make this a better project and possibly make it more likely to be funded. But you'll notice, again, just to drive home the point, very clear sections, very clear titles, very clear labels. And that's what we want to do to make it as easy as possible for our readers to understand our reasoning, our analysis, and our conclusions.